Hi, let's talk about adolescents and their relationships with their parents. And we'll start with putting things in context. So I'm going to show you a little clip from a very nice movie called Pleasantville. And it shows, how life were in the 50s and things have changed. Let's watch the clip.
There's a place where life is simple. People are perfect. And everything is black and white.
Honey, I'm home.
It's a place that's as far from reality as we can imagine.
How about some marshmallow rice squares?
Those are swell.
But maybe it's a lot closer
Let me see that.
than we think.
What happened?
I'm not sure.
Look at me. I'm pasty.
Morning, kids. Better get a move on or you'll be late for school.
I put blueberries in them just the way you like.
We're in Pleasantville?
No!
We're supposed to be in school.
We're supposed to be in color?
What's all the commotion?
Who's that?
I didn't think you'd want to come here until we'd been pinned for a little while.
You can pin me anytime you want to. Or maybe I should just pin you.
She's a fine young woman. She would never do anything for us to be concerned about.
From the creator of Big and Dave,
What are you doing to these people? You can't do this to them. You're messing with their whole universe.
Maybe it needs to be messed with, David.
comes a story about the loss of innocence.
I brought you something from the library.
Gee whiz.
And the power of change.
What's outside of Pleasantville? There's some places where the road keeps going.
You shouldn't cover that up.
What is that?
What's going on? It's rain. Honey, I'm home.
New Line Cinema presents
Look at my face.
It'll go away.
I don't want it to go away.
Something is happening to our town.
Jeff Daniels, William H. Macy, Joan Allen, Reese Witherspoon, and Tobey Maguire.
So what's going to happen now?
I don't know.
Pleasantville.
What are we gonna do, Bob? Well, we're safe for now. Thank goodness we're in a bowling alley.
So things have changed. You can see this wonderful 1950s family with a stay-at-home mom. Dad gets back from work at 5 p.m. Honey, I'm home. They have dinner and everyone is clean and tidy. The context in which parents and adolescents live in today is quite different. We're talking about less than 15% of today's youth living with both biological parents, where the father is the sole provider. That's very rare these days. What used to be in the 50s. We're talking about high rate of divorce. We're talking about the double paycheck family, meaning that both parents go to work. Both parents are career oriented. They get to spend less time with their kids. And we're talking about, in the United States, about most adolescents born in the 1990s living in single parent families. So it's quite different than what we saw in Pleasantville. If we look at the statistics about how much time adolescents spend with the different members of their family, we can see a very clear trend whereby adolescents spend less and less time with their family in general and with their parents in particular. And if we drew a similar graph about what percentage of their time they're spending with their peers, with their friends, we would have the opposite trend, meaning that as they grow older, they spend more and more time with friends. Now, one of the things that are very important in parent-adolescent relationships is this whole notion of storm and stress. There are a lot of people who think that teenagers must rebel. It's part of adolescence. If they don't do it, then there's something wrong. It may come up in a worse kind of way. And so it's very important for adolescents to rebel. But the research shows otherwise. We're talking about 1/4 of adolescents in a full-blown surge of crisis and conflict throughout their adolescence. We're talking about 1/3 that have periods of smooth adaptation, and then periods that are negative, that are more they experience more storm and stress, and about 1/4 have continuous growth without much negative interaction with their parents. So it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that there's storm and stress, but it is important to acknowledge that there is conflict, and the conflict does indeed arise in early adolescence and remain there for a few years. And it's especially bad between mothers and daughters. There's a lot of tension there a lot of the times. And at the end of adolescence, the conflict decreases. I always quote one of the social workers I worked with many years ago in Canada. Her daughter was a very stormy adolescent, and then she went to college, and she came back for Christmas or some other break, and then after a few days, she came to her mother and she told her, you know, Mom, while I was in college, Dad and you really changed. So, you know, that really shows the way that, you know, at the end of adolescence, we see the tension decreasing, and the adolescents feeling, you know, much calmer around their parents. Another thing that's important to say is that this is very common in Western societies, in more societies that are more secular, less traditional. And when we look at more traditional societies, then we see a lot less debate between parents and adolescents. For example, it has to do with economics. So the family is all engaged together in relying on one another to provide, and so there's less conflict. And also things that have to do with authority and hierarchy and patriarchy. All these things also are quite different among in more traditional societies. Mark Twain once said that when he was 14, his father was so ignorant he couldn't bear looking at him. But when he was 21, he was amazed to see how much he's learned in 7 years. So that's another sort of citation that really shows it changes over the years. So there's hope. Another important aspect is the myth. So I said before that you don't have to have a wild adolescence. You don't have to be in conflict with your parents throughout adolescence. And we see that, you know, about 1/4 experience pretty smooth growth without any conflicts, with not any, but without any significant conflicts with their parents. But then there's this myth that the adolescents have to rebel, and so what happens is that you keep getting these advice, you keep getting these communications that your adolescence is supposed to rebel, and you reinforce it. Of course, you don't want to reinforce it as a parent, but you do. So the minute that the adolescent is a bit cheeky, you immediately say, "Oh, here's adolescence. It has arrived." And so the kid, the adolescent, the teenager, they understand, oh, this is my role, and this is reinforced. So this is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's also, of course, reinforced by the models that they're getting from TV shows and so on. So it's very important to keep in mind the myth, and I would advise all of you not to take it for granted that, you know, that, for example, your adolescent starts talking inappropriately or anything like that. Don't accept it, you know, oh, here it comes, it's inevitable, and so on. You still have to set boundaries. Boundaries are very important for adolescents. They rebel. When they rebel, they need that boundary. That's part of their identity negotiation. So they want to make clear that they're not like you. They're a different person. They have their own identity, and so they could be, for example, cheeky, and then they have to see that there's a response from the parent. All in all, it's very important to say that when we look at studies, for example, both in the US and in Israel, there's no emotional distance between teenagers and parents. And when we look at core values, they're very much the same between adolescents and their parents. And what we see is that there are certain issues that are a lot of the times very, very different. And they are the core issues. For example, fashion, music preferences. My daughters have to tell me all the time that the music I listen to is horrible, and the only thing, you know, that's really good is the Korean BTS band and Billie Eilish and stuff like that. And nothing in Hebrew is, of course, good. All the Hebrew music is worthless, and so on. And that's fine. You know, there's no point in arguing with them about that. You know, perhaps I can't understand how they can listen to a Beatles song and say that it's worthless, but that's the way it works. By the way, if the Beatles are on TikTok and there's a new trend with the Beatles song, all of a sudden they're good. And another funny thing is that when there's a cover version of an old song, the new version is really good, but the old one wasn't that good, and so on. So it's really about not very important things like music and fashion and recreational activities, the environment these days. In America, it's a lot about curfew. It's not as big here in Israel, but that's another big issue between adolescents and their parents about curfew. And so the core beliefs are very, very similar. When you talk about things like politics, then the kids are very similar to the parents. When you talk about things about like vocational preferences, so the number one predictor of your vocation is your parents' vocation, and so that remains the same. So, but we reinforce the myth. They're so different, so different than us. Another myth I can talk about has to do with computers. They talk about this generation about them being natives in the computer land. So they were born into the internet, and we're immigrants. The older generations are immigrants. And again, there's a lot of research that opposes that view and says it's not that true. You know, being able to play Minecraft and Fortnite doesn't make you computer savvy. And a lot of us, especially now with the coronavirus, become very, very proficient with computers and the internet and so on. So it's not that it's not as commonsensical and as people pretend it is. And so if we look at studies as early as the 60s and up till now, adolescents and their parents agree on most important life issues. The large majority of adolescents love their parents, believe them, and even admire them. And the differences in opinions are usually around minor issues, as I said, like clothes and curfew and music and so on. In Israel, there's a lot of research showing that the Israeli youth have a lot of expectation from their parents. They expect them to solve a lot of problems for them with school, then with the army and all that part of, you know, being that before being drafted and having all these negotiations and so on. They recognize their parents' authorities. They recognize their parents' good intention. the mother is the active actor in communication, so she is usually the one that is perceived to communicate with teachers and so on, and the father is sort of more evading responsibility, and he is the sort of special missions guy. So when there's a real problem, then you consult the father. Of course, I'm not saying this is the way it should be. I'm just saying this is the way most adolescents perceive it. As the process of adolescence progresses, then the mothers reduce their authority and give the adolescents more independence. Still, most fathers are considered more authoritarian. I'll talk about that in a second. And adolescents really, they have this negotiation with their parents. On the one hand, they demand their autonomy, they want to shape their identity, they need to be different than their parents. And on the other hand, they need them, they need the help. They cannot cope with a lot of the things on their own. They're still not adults, they're still not independent, they're still not on their own. So there's always this balance between independence and neediness, let's say. A very important theoretician in psychology by the name of Margaret Mahler, she spoke about a process that begins at a very early age called separation individuation. So she spoke about the fact that when you're born, the mother and child are sort of infused, and the little baby doesn't even understand if she's part of her mother or it's different. Is the breast part of her or part of the mother? Is her hand part of her or part of the mother, and so on? So it's really very, very diffuse at the beginning. And as time goes by, of course, you understand where your body begins and ends. But when it comes to the mind, the soul, the psyche, then it's not that simple, and things are still infused for many, many years. And you have to go through a process of separation individuation. And Mahler concentrated on the first 4 years. That's the period that she investigated and talked a lot about how this process develops of becoming your own individual and becoming separated from your parents. But of course, it doesn't end at the age of 4. And a lot of researchers and theoreticians after that continue to talk about separation individuation throughout life, and of course in adolescence. That's a very important developmental line. So during adolescence, you continue to define yourself as an individual. You become more separated from your parents. You try to deny your neediness of them, and so on. By the way, I think I mentioned it before, I'll mention it again. There are a lot of parallels between the period between 2 and 4, 2 years to 4 years of age, and adolescence. Between 2 years and 4 years, we're talking about the terrible twos. We're talking about egocentrism in a very, very concrete sense. You know, when you play hide and seek with a 2-year-old, they'll close their eyes and think that no one sees them because they're so egocentric. They think that everything they see is what everyone else sees. And so you have the tantrums, you have the egocentrism, and you have this this wish to become more independent. You can see these kids going around with their orange juices at the age of 2.5, and the father is trying to say to them, "Oh, just let me help you for a second." "No, I want it on my own," and so on. Then they spill the juice and all that. And that's exactly what happens in adolescence. So they want to do it on their own, and sometimes they screw it up, but still, you know, they have to become independent. That's part of. So there are a lot of parallels between ages 2 to 4 and adolescence. And again, during adolescence, they're still not adults. In a more psychoanalytic terminology, we're talking about the weakness of the ego. So the ego is the part in psychoanalytic theory that negotiates with the environment. the part that has all the functions to operate in reality, and it's still not fully developed, and that's why you still need the parents as sort of an external ego to help you with, and this is a concept Bloss was talking about. So, as I said before, I alluded to that before, leaving home is really good for the relationship between adolescents and their parents. It gets much, much better when the person leaves home. They report greater closeness, less negative feelings. And in research in the United States, the magic figure is 1 hour. So you need to be 1 hour away. That's the best for a level of closeness and intimacy between parents and their adolescents. I mean, adolescents, 18-year-old, 20-year-old, and so on. And those who stay at home report the worst relationship. I said I'll talk about authoritarians. So one of the important theoreticians in developmental psychology is Baumrind, and she had all sorts of taxonomies trying to describe parenting, but this is the most famous that has two axes. So one has to do with boundaries, and the other one has to do with warmth. And she says that this constellation of warmth and boundaries, provides the parenting styles. So when you provide no warmth and no empathy, then you're neglectful. When you only provide warmth, but you don't provide any boundaries, then it is called permissive parenting. When you provide only boundaries but no warmth, it's called authoritarian. And when you provide both, it is the ideal sort of parenting style, which is called authoritative. So for example, in an authoritative, let's start with the authoritarian. So in an authoritarian parenting style, you say, because I said so, my house, my rules, you don't explain, you don't want to know about what the adolescent is talking about. It's just in a permissive sort of style, you would say, sure, you want to have a party at home when we're abroad, that's fine. The keys to the drinks cabinet is in dad's socks drawer. And in an authoritative kind of parenting, so for example, when you have a negotiation with the adolescent, you would say, you cannot go to the mall today, and we've decided to see Aunt Jen because she's sick. Shall we drop you off at your friend's house on the way home? Is that enough of a compromise? So you sort of see your adolescent's needs, but you still maintain boundaries. And finally, the neglectful parenting is sort of adolescent says, Mom, are you home? There's no answer. Okay, I'll make dinner for myself again. So no warmth and no boundaries and no mom. I'll just talk about a couple of more psychoanalytically oriented psychologists and their view of parenting. So one of the most influential psychologists was Donald Winnicott, and he spoke about good enough parenting. So this is more of a humble approach, saying that you need to provide good enough parenting. You don't need to be perfect all the time. You just need to be good enough. And what is the most important aspect of parenting according to Winnicott? The most important aspect is attunement, sensitivity, meaning that you understand what your baby, kid, adolescent is telling you. So it starts with a baby crying, and you are sort of attuned to the cry, and you understand what the baby wants, whether he wants his diaper changed, or whether he wants a blanket or a hug or whatever. And you're attuned, and when you provide exactly what the baby wanted, the baby is sort of reinforced in his connection to his feelings. So he knows, oh, this is exactly what I wanted. So I get validation for that. And then it continues, you go to a 7-year-old and he says, I'm bored. And so if you're not attuned, you would say something like, then read a book. That's it. But if you're more sensitive, you would try to understand what bored means, because it can mean a lot of different things. It can mean I have problems with math here. It can mean I'm alone, I don't have any friends. It can mean a lot of very different things, but you need to be attuned to that. And of course, it continues in adolescent when, for example, the adolescent grunts, and you have to interpret and understand and be attuned to the adolescent's needs. And what Winnicott places a lot of emphasis on is that when the parent is not attuned, is not sensitive, and he does not, the parents do not provide the feedback that the child needs, and so the child become very insecure about their feelings. Children become very insecure about their feelings. So they're not sure if what they felt is really the right thing. So the kid comes to his parents and he says, I want to take violin class. And they say, what are you talking about? Only nerds take violin. You should go to soccer. If you want to really succeed in school and be popular, you need to go to soccer. And he says, okay, maybe I should, right? I'm not sure. And he plays soccer for many years, but he's not sure. So, and this is what Winnicott calls a false self. And of course, it doesn't begin and end with the soccer class. It's something that has happened throughout the childhood. So throughout childhood, when the kid expressed needs, they were not met. They were reflected back differently. So the kid says one thing and the parent says, oh no, you probably want something else. And so this lack of attunement can lead to the worst thing, according to Winnicott, which is a false self, this feeling that you're walking around in the world and you don't know who you are. He said that's much worse than depression or schizophrenia or anything else. These can be very functioning people, but they just don't know who they are. And so another phrase that he termed is called holding. And a holding environment is sensitive. It provides the emotional needs that the child has, while handling is only providing the more physical, day-to-day stuff that the child needs. So that's in a nutshell about Winnicott's theory. Of course, you can read a lot about it if you want. And another very important psychologist when it comes to parenting is Kohut. And Heinz Kohut, he speaks about narcissism, but he doesn't talk about narcissism as something bad at all. He talks about narcissism as an integral part of every person's life. So we all need other people. So this is very different from Margaret Mahler that I spoke about before, who speaks about wanting to be separate, an individual. Kohut says we always need other people. We always need feedback. Doesn't matter how many achievements we've had in our lives. We always need to get positive feedback from other people. And this is sort of the natural narcissism. Now, when kids are very young, they need a lot of it. And they get a lot of it usually. In a very natural process, they're being admired. They get a lot of idealization. And he called it mirroring. So people see how gorgeous and wonderful these babies are, what a genius they are, and so on. And so this is very important. It's very important to get these narcissistic needs when you're very young, and it provides the energy for life. Only when you get it can you believe in yourself later in life and say, yeah, I can do it. But of course, you need to be very careful about that, because if you continue to just idealize your kid throughout life, then you'll get a monster. And so Kohut spoke about a process of optimal frustration. So little by little, bit by bit, you frustrate your child. He doesn't get, or she doesn't get, the same response that they used to when they were younger. So when he was 1 year old and he started walking, of course you pulled out your iPhone and you took pictures and you sent it to all the family, and everyone, were so proud. But, you know, as time goes by, you need to do a lot to get these kind of responses. And this is the frustration. You don't need to, you know, berate your child. The frustration is about not getting the same feedback at the same rate. And little by little, you understand, you know, you're loved by your family, but you're not the greatest thing that have ever happened to the human race. That's the very important process that every kid needs to go through, that he called transmuting internalization. So you internalize the fact that, you know, you're very special to your family, but you're just another person in this world. You're not, you know, you're not God's gift to this planet. So this was, again, in a nutshell, but I hope it adds another aspect to parenting and parent-adolescent relationships. And this will be it for part 1 of adolescence.